How you doing? I'm John. I'd like to welcome you to my channel, the Old Timer Tales, and pretty much from one old timer to a bunch of old timers. Our tale tonight is written by a guy named Stephen Benét, who wrote a lot of really good stuff. He's an American treasure. He wrote a book called John Brown's Body, which is incredible. If you're interested in the Civil War, it's an incredible poem. And I hate to tell people that because then they're afraid of it. And it's not. I'm not a poetry reader, but I read that bad boy all the way through. And this is his other big piece, and it's about Daniel Webster. And unfortunately, a lot of us don't know much about Daniel Webster. He was one of the three great statesmen of his time: Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun. And we don't hardly remember any of them today. And this was back when legislators, people in the Congress and the House, they used to actually pass laws and solve the problems of the nation. Anyway, this is a really good story. It takes place in New Hampshire. It's a story about New Hampshire. It's a story about America, really. And it's a story they tell in the border country where Massachusetts joins Vermont and New Hampshire. Yes, Daniel Webster's dead, or at least they buried him. But every time there's a thunderstorm around Marshfield, they say you can hear his rolling voice in the hollows of the sky. And they say that if you go to his grave and speak loud and clear, Daniel Webster, Daniel Webster, the ground will begin to quiver and the trees begin to shake. And after a while, you hear a deep voice saying, "Neighbor, how stands the Union?" And then you better answer. The Union stands as she stood, rock bottom and copper sheathed, one and indivisible, or he's liable to tear right out the ground. At least that's what I was told when I was a youngster. You see, for a while he was the biggest man in the country. He never got to be president, but he was the biggest man. There were thousands that trusted him right next to God Almighty, and they told stories about him and all the things that belonged to him. They were like the stories of the patriarchs and such. They said when he stood up to speak, the stars and stripes came right out the sky. And once he spoke up against a river, it made it sink into the ground. They said when he walked in the woods with his fishing rod, kill all, the trout would jump out the streams right into his pockets, for they knew it was no use putting up a fight against him. And when he argued a case, he could turn on the harps of the blessed and the shaking of the earth underground. That was the kind of man he was. His big farm up at Marshfield was suitable to him. The chickens he raised were all white meat down through the drumsticks. The cows he tended were like his children. And the big ram called Goliath had horns like a curl on a morning glory vine and could butt through an iron door. Daniel wasn't one of your gentleman farmers. He knew all the ways of the land, and he'd be up by candlelight to see that the chores got done. A man with a mouth like a mastiff, a brow like a mountain, and eyes like burning anthracite. That was Daniel Webster in his prime. And the biggest case he argued never got written down in the books, and he argued against the devil, nip and tuck. And this is the way I used to hear it told. There was a man named Jabez Stone, lived across corners, New Hampshire. He wasn't a bad man to start with, but he was an unlucky man. If he planted corn, he got borers. If he planted potatoes, he got blight. He had good enough land, but it didn't prosper him. He had a decent wife and children, but the more children he had, the less he had to feed them. If stones cropped up in his neighbor's field, boulders boiled up in his. If he had a horse with the spavins, he'd trade it for one with the staggers and give something extra. There's some folks bound to be like that, apparently. But one day, Jabez Stone got sick of the whole business. He'd been plowing that morning and had just broke the plowshare on a rock he could have sworn hadn't been there yesterday. And as he stood looking at the plowshare, the off horse began to cough, that ropey kind of cough that means sickness and horse doctors. There were 2 children down with the measles. His wife was ailing, and he had a whitlow in his thumb. It was about the last straw for Jabez Stone. "I vow," he said, looked around kind of desperate. If I was enough to make a man want to sell his soul to the devil, I would, for 2 cents. Then he felt a kind of queerness come over him for having said what he'd said, though naturally, being a New Hampshire man, he wouldn't take it back. But all the same, when it got to be evening, as far as he could see, no notice had been taken. He felt relieved in his mind, for he was a religious man. But notice is always taken, sooner or later, just like the good book says. And sure enough, next day about supper time, a soft-spoken, dark-dressed stranger drew up in a handsome buggy and asked for Jabez Stone. Well, Jabez told his family he was a lawyer, come to see him about a legacy, but he knew who it was. He didn't like the looks of the stranger, nor the way he smiled with his teeth. They were white teeth and plentiful. Some say they were filed to a point, but I wouldn't vouch for that. And he didn't like it when the dog took one look at the stranger and ran away howling with his tail between his legs. But having passed his word, more or less, he stuck to it, and they went out behind the barn and made their bargain. Jabez Stone had to prick his finger to sign, and the stranger lent him a silver pin. The wound healed clean, but it left a little white scar. Alright, well, that's the end of part 1. Hope you like it. Hope you stick around for part 2, and welcome to the Old Time Tales.